Welcome to Mysticism and Psychedelics, Lecture 2. My name is Dr. Roger Green, if you're getting this in podcast form, or if you somehow missed Lecture 1. So we're going to look at psychedelic classics, or classics in psychedelic literature today. And so when you read scientific literature with its irritating American Psychological Association format that simply lists authors' last names and dates without giving any discursive context, writers like Aldous Huxley and Mircea Eliade still frequently appear in psychedelic research without any kind of qualifications as to ways that they've been problematized by researchers and thinkers in the field of psychedelic studies. Now, I'll admit that Aldous Huxley holds a special place in my heart, and my own book situates him as a better political theological thinker for the 21st century than the German Carl Schmitt, who wrote a book called Political Theology. That was kind of what my part of what my book was about. But even though I situate Huxley as a better thinker for us in the 21st century, that doesn't mean that we should not approach Huxley critically, even if he remains foundational to the field. And so I'm going to be critical, even though I admire Aldous Huxley for various reasons. But before jumping into Huxley's famous account of mescaline in The Doors of Perception, there are a few important precursors that we might look at in terms of writing about drug experiences. I won't cover everything, but I'm going to cover a couple of special instances. So notable books include Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater from 1821, Fitzhugh Ludlow's The Hashish Eater from 1857, and Charles Baudelaire's Artificial Paradises from about 1860. Friedrich Nietzsche also theorized influentially on narcotics. In the Birth of Tragedy and the Spirit of Music, he says, quote, "Up to this point, we've considered the Apollonian and its opposite, the Dionysian, as artistic forces which break forth out of nature itself, without the mediation of the human artist, and in which the human artistic drive is for the time being satisfied directly. On the one hand, as a world of dream images whose perfection has no connection with an individual's high level of intellect or artistic education. On the other hand, as the intoxicating reality which once again does not respect the individual, but even seeks to abolish the individual and to restore him through a mystic feeling of collective unity. In comparison to these unmediated artistic states of nature, every artist is a, quote, imitator, and in fact, an artist either of Apollonian dream or Dionysian intoxication, or, finally, as in the Greek tragedy, for example, simultaneously an artist of intoxication and dreams. As the last, it is possible for us to imagine how he sinks into the Dionysian drunkenness and mystical obliteration of the self, alone and apart from the rapturous throng, and how through the Apollonian effects of dream in his own state now reveal itself to him. That is, his unity with the innermost basis of the world and a metaphorical dream picture. End quote. So that was kind of a long quote. And for those of you who have read Nietzsche before, he contrasts these kind of opposites, Apollonian and Dionysian, in a kind of binary. But as he already says in this passage, that of course in his depiction of Greek tragedy, there's a fusion of the two. So they're not entirely separate spheres. And we need to think about a lot of psychedelic discourse in the 20th century and 21st century will oftentimes allude to Eleusinian mysteries, for example, from the ancient Greeks. And we will need to talk about that. And my own approach is to take those authors critically, or read them critically for the kinds of assumptions and motivations that they might have in their own scholarship, to make the kinds of observations that they do about ancient Greek culture. But we see it happening in Nietzsche. And so writers on the cultural history of drugs frequently cite Nietzsche's call in The Gay Science, for example. He says, quote, "Who will narrate to us the whole history of narcotica? It is almost the history of culture, of our so-called higher culture." Our being human beings for him, right? So we can see in Nietzsche the theme of madness and the dissolution of ego connected with mysticism. William James, a little bit further on around the turn of the 20th century, had been introduced to peyote and mescaline by Havelock Ellis. And he wrote about the liberating aspects of alcohol and the varieties of religious experience. So already by the late 19th century, there's a discourse going on well before the well-known psychedelic drugs that we know today are in existence. Another writer, Walter Benjamin, in the 20th century explored writings on hashish. Anthropologists became increasingly interested in peyote after it spread through American Indian resistance movements in the late 19th century. Eventually, the avowedly, quote, Christian Native American Church was founded in 1918. And we will talk more about the foundation of churches that use psychedelic substances throughout the course. Artistic circles in the early 1900s were imbibing peyote, especially transplants from New York to New Mexico, such as Mabel Dodge Luhan, and a cadre of people around her. So notable among the circle was D.H. Lawrence, who was a novelist, writer, English writer, who had an experience of transforming into a coyote after ingesting a lot of peyote. D.H. Lawrence and Aldous Huxley were extremely close friends. They were interested in ideas of Nietzsche's and breaking out of the constricted social life of Victorian England, but also in American Indian life. The character of John Savage, for example, in Brave New World, owes much inspiration to D.H. Lawrence, who had died in 1928. And that was a really big impact, Lawrence's death on Huxley. Although not about drugs, D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover, which was published in 1929, just after his death, also addresses these themes of animality, of the extensions of humanity, themes that go back to Nietzsche. And Huxley, again, like very affected by his friend's death, would write in a couple of years later the lesser-known book called Beyond the Mexique Bay. And that's a travelogue that he wrote about Central America. And so we know that Huxley is already, early on thinking about a lot of things. We know that the soma drug, which is a reference back to the Rig Veda, shows up in 1931's Brave New World. But it has a kind of negative sense in that book. And writers on psychedelics have often said, if we're going to talk about Huxley, we need to talk about his whole career, because between the early 1930s and his last novel, Island, which is finished in 1962-ish, and then it's published in just after his death, or right around his death in the early 60s. So Huxley died the same morning that Kennedy was shot, and he died on his deathbed, took LSD. So he slipped away, like he literally got high, and according to his wife, Maria Huxley, at the time, he went peacefully off into the void. And so he becomes a kind of figure in psychedelic studies for somebody who really embraced the potential of psychedelics. Um, but he writes, I mean, I think it's worth looking at books like Beyond the Mexique Bay. Um, Lady Chatterley's Lover, just to go back to Lawrence for a second, was scandalous at the time that it was published, and it was barred from publication in many places until a 1960 obscenity case was won by Penguin Books. So this is important because we see that kind of 30-year lap between the early 30s and the 60s when Huxley is dead. Um, it's relevant especially because at the time, William Burroughs's deeply psychedelic book, Naked Lunch, which some of you may have read, was also on trial for obscenities. And those cases helped to loosen the censorship rules in the 1960s. And when those censorship rules got loosened, not just for novels, but for films, and we can see things like the Hays Code going away in films, it opens up in broader, especially US culture, a all sorts of artistic expression, all sorts of removal of limitations of censorship around nudity and things like this. And this prefigures and helps bring in the late 60s movements, including the psychedelic movement, the free love movement, and all of that. So these things are sort of tied together with bigger cultural forces, and especially legal forces. So let's turn to the Doors of Perception now. In the opening pages of Huxley's Doors of Perception, which comes out in 1954, Huxley retells his 1953 mescaline experience with Dr. Humphrey Osmond. Osmond is important again from lecture one because Osmond is the one who coins the term psychedelic in a letter, I think it's from 1957 actually, to Aldous Huxley. And they're trying to think up a better term than psychotomimetic, which means mimicking psychosis or mimicking madness, because they believe that psychedelics have greater potential for human culture, therapeutic, end-of-life care, all sort the things that are very commonplace to us in the psychedelic renaissance today. So Huxley tellingly describes each individual as in the Doors of Perception as an island universe. So this is before he's written his final novel, Island, and some people might want to read that book. I haven't assigned it for this particular class, but it's worth looking at these earlier writings on drugs, and seeing how they shape not just the fact that like drugs show up, like something like psilocybin or psilocybin mushrooms shows up as the main moksha drug. So moksha in Sanskrit means something like liberation, right? And so if soma is the drug in Brave New World, moksha is the drug in Island. And it's got a much more positive connotation in that book than soma had in the earlier dystopian book, Brave New World. So so in the Doors of Perception, Huxley's already describing each individual as an island universe. And the idea is going to, of course, as it inspires the later novel, Island, but this is what he says in Doors of Perception, quote, "The mind is its own place, and the places inhabited by the insane and the exceptionally gifted are so different from the places where ordinary men and women live that there is little or no common ground of memory to serve as a basis for understanding or fellow feeling. Words are uttered but fail to enlighten. The things and events to which the symbols refer belong to mutually exclusive realms of experience." So Huxley sees this chasm, right, between madness and between the normal person, but also the gifted person, right? So we're going to see on and on with the especially the mid 20th century thinkers, a flirtation with like a philosophical kind of discourse on what is madness itself, because earlier psychedelic drugs were called psychotomimetic, right, mimicking psychosis, and it was thought that if you, as a researcher, especially if you're a psychologist or a psychiatrist, that you might be able to take the drug and be able to understand your patients better because you would have gone through a temporary kind of madness. So later in the text here of Doors of Perception, Huxley refers through the writer C.D. Broad to Henri Bergson's notion of the brain and the sense organs. And he says the brain and sense organs is, in the main, eliminative and not productive. So he says, he goes on to say that if the theory is correct, each of us is potentially a mind at large. A complementary notion of this appears as the noosphere, which had developed from the writer Pierre Teilhard de Chardin and Vladimir Vernadsky during the 1920s. And the basic idea here is that consciousness in our brains, whatever we call consciousness, and it's sometimes argued whether or not consciousness is a thing, depending on the circle that you work in, that consciousness or our mind is a kind of filter, and it is a reducing valve for Huxley. And what we experience of the rest of the world or the universe is this narrowed version of things. And so you can think about the ways that our brain might like filter out our autonomic nervous system, right? Like I'm not thinking at the like all the time of keeping my heart beating, for example. And it's the kind of reducing valve quality of our minds that allows us to focus and to maneuver about in the world. But there's something, he says, that according to Henri Bergson, the French philosopher who was like really the most famous philosopher of the early half of the 20th century, that sensibility in the brain is about a reduction of feeling. That's their theory. Now you may buy that or continue on, but I just wanted to sort of note that that's what they're thinking about in the 1950s. So we can return to that notion, especially through Richard Doyle's really, really good book called Darwin's Pharmacy, which was published about a decade ago, I think around 2011. For Huxley, though, so consciousness is this reducing valve. Huxley believed that most people live a daily reduced consciousness that is itself necessary for survival. But certain people throughout human history have had a kind of bypass that allows them to access what he calls the mind at large. Drugs and spiritual exercises exist to give, quote, normal people temporary access. And then Huxley's experience, while novel at the time, has been confirmed over and over again. So generally speaking, classic psychedelics do not, unless we take very extreme doses, produce dissociative effects. You might get that on ketamine, which is not like a classic psychedelic, but it will give you more of a dissociative experience, and that's why that therapy is being used more these days for extreme post-traumatic stress, because you almost need that extra dissociative ability to revisit an experience, whereas MDMA or ecstasy is going to give you a sort of closer but a softened way of re-experiencing those things. And we could talk more about that, but I just want to focus a little bit more on Huxley today. So yeah, generally speaking, classic psychedelics do not, unless taken in very extreme doses, produce dissociative effects. The reducing valve is still there. And we can think clearly on psychedelics with self-awareness. Our motor skills continue to work. They might be a little distorted, but we generally know that even if we're sort of floating in space or really tripping out, like we can generally still walk around. Now, I don't advocate driving a car or something like that. But even our motor skills continue to work, as does our ability to speak most of the time, even if what we speak about seems ineffable or inarticulable in the moment. So with respect to mescaline, quote, Huxley says, quote, visual impressions are greatly intensified, and a kind of novelty often associated with a childlike innocence, accompanies perception. Both space and time perception is reduced. A kind of disinterestedness occurs in the intellect. Distinctions between inner and outer are reduced. Huxley says, quote, in the final stages of egolessness, there is an obscure knowledge that all is in all and that all is actually each. It's starting to sound very mystical, right? Huxley goes on to discuss the richness of color perception, which he associates with mystics. He recognizes a similarity in suchness of Van Gogh's chair, but notes that art's representational qualities hold it back from the full experience of suchness. Art, quote, is only for beginners, end quote. He notes that the fascination with texture in the dress of Botticelli's Judith and its folded textiles. He then goes on a diatribe of different artists' works. He says, quote, what the rest of us see only under the influence of mescaline, the artist is congenitally equipped to see all the time. So this is a very romantic sense of the artist, or that Huxley has in his head, right? Like artists are special people that have a little bit wider or more porous areas in our reducing valve consciousness, according to Huxley. So for him, this is a capacity, though, for the artist to see things how they truly are. He then moves on to the complexity of human relations and how things ought to be. Disinterestedness, like kind of stepping back from things, takes over the human ethical interactions and utilitarian concerns when one's on mescaline. All of this is according to Huxley, right? Representations and reduced consciousness produce a profound sense of self-importance. But he says, quote, who do human beings think they are? He compares Vermeer to Cézanne. He says Vermeer, the painter, never asked his girls to look like apples. The suchness of the Dharma body is contrasted with Plato's idealized and abstracted forms. Then Huxley comes back to tensions between active and contemplative, so different personality types. He mentions the way of Mary and Martha, and says that mescaline opens up the way of Mary, who was open to God. It opens up a path to contemplation, but not action. He mentions active contemplatives like Meister Eckhart, and contrasts worldly bodhisattvas against Buddhist arhats, and then Rembrandt to Cézanne. So he's mixing up all of these kind of mystical kind of figures or ideas, both from Buddhism or from other Far Eastern and also from Western tradition like Meister Eckhart, and fuses them with artists, specifically painters, right? So as he comes down from mescaline, he starts seeing things as cheap, but notes that contemplatives may bring back enlightening reports of a transcendent country of the mind. Listen to that language, a transcendent country of the mind. And if they practice it in height, they will become conduits through which some beneficent influence can flow out of that country into a world of darkened selves, chronically dying for lack of it. So Huxley notes with respect to this cheapness that he perceived that mescaline had failed to bring him to a profound and holy place. Quote, what it had allowed me to perceive inside was not the Dharma body and images, but my own mind, not suchness, but a set of symbols. In other words, a homemade substitute for suchness. So he believes he didn't quite have the expanded sense that the true artists and mystics of the world might have, but he got a little bit of a sense of what that might be like to be like them. Still, Huxley admits that many who take mescaline get to experience what visionaries experience. So they maybe get to experience even more than him. However, he says there are limits. The untalented visionary may perceive an inner reality no less tremendous, beautiful, and significant than the world beheld by Blake, but he lacks altogether the ability to express in literary or plastic symbols what he has seen. He sees Christianity's doctrine of the fall as world denying. Yet in the Far East, he says landscape painting could be regarded as religious. He then shifts to his discussion from painting to poetry, and Huxley sees a parallel turn in the 20th century towards interiority in both painting and poetry. You can think about the shift towards abstract expressionism going on in the United States at the time that Huxley's writing this. Then he moves towards music. He's more interested in vocal music than in instrumental music. He hears fragmentation while perceiving a greater totality. This becomes more extreme in 12-tone music, and he mentions Alban Berg, the serialist composer of the early 20th century. So then Huxley goes for a walk. So this is all happening again in Doors of Perception. I'm just kind of summarizing what he says. Huxley then goes for a walk. He feels detached from his body, but its motor functioning is intact. In my present state, awareness was not referred to as ego. It was, so to speak, on its own. This meant that the psychological intelligence controlling the body was blessedly out of the way. He becomes entirely absorbed in the outdoors and feels like he has learned what it's like to be mad. He discusses schizophrenia, but also talks of manic highs and depressive lows that mescaline can bring on. He says reasonably healthy individuals know they have nothing to fear from the mescaline experience. Then he turns to religion. And he cites Rudolf Otto's concept of the mysterium tremendum. And we'll talk about this concept in later lectures as well in more detail. He then turns to the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And he compares the experience to the experience of the schizophrenic. He says, quote, "The schizophrenic is like a man permanently under the influence of mescaline, and therefore unable to shut off the experience of a reality which he is not holy enough to live with, which he cannot explain away because it is the most stubborn of primary facts, and which, because it never permits him to look at the inner world with merely human eyes, scares him into interpreting its unremitting strangeness, its burning intensity of significance, as the manifestations of human or even cosmic malevolence, calling for the most desperate countermeasures, from murderous violence at one end of the scale to catatonia or psychological suicide at the other. And once embarked upon the infernal road, one would never be able to stop. That now was only too obvious." So he feels like he has this ability to see into what it's like to be schizophrenic. This turns into a discussion of set and setting, which is two terms that we use in drug research all the time. A set is what you are bringing to your drug experience, or what the patient, the client, the initiate is bringing to this set. And the setting is going to be the environment, right? So your set is going to include your own perceptions of what you think is going to happen to you on your psychedelic or other a drug experience, right? So that will affect us, the ways that we perceive things. If you grew up in dare culture like I did, or drug resistance culture, then you might be more likely to have a negative or paranoid experience on certain drugs because you've been informed by culture that this can produce all sorts of negative effects, for example. And then the setting is going to be, your environment. Are you at a rave? Are you at Burning Man? Are you in a doctor's office? Are you at home? Are you in an ayahuasca ceremony, etc.? So he doesn't actually use the word set and setting, but that this is being implied here. And so it's just another important moment in Huxley's work for us as psychedelic researchers. The interviewer then asks Huxley if Huxley can control his madness, and Huxley says no. He says the interviewer asks if he could fix his attention on the clear light of the void from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And Huxley says that one couldn't do it alone, but perhaps with a guide to help one not get distracted. He notes that he's using the Evans Wentz translation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and so we'll talk about different translations of Tibetan Book of the Dead in later lectures. But he speculates on the possibility for modern psychiatrists to use the techniques of Buddhist monks with dying people to help the insane. He considers constant recordings through sleep and then public address systems, so all sorts of behavior modification, or early attempts at behavior modification. And I think this is why Huxley remains fundamentally important for us in psychedelic studies, because he's like, there it is, like in the Doors of Perception. This is where this kind of Tibetan Book of the Dead stuff, therapeutic end of life care stuff starts showing up, and then also behavior modification stuff shows up. Now Huxley doesn't invent all of it, but he definitely condenses it, and he becomes kind of like the first real theorist of what psychedelic experience can be. So returning back to the book, returning to his narrative, Huxley is transfixed by vegetation. He laughs at cars. He goes inside and eats. They go for a drive. He says Eden alternated with Dodona, Yggdrasil with the mystic rose, like the Rosy Cross or the Rosicrucians, right? Lots of biblical imagery in these passages, and the city is at one point compared to New Jerusalem. So these are, all of these kinds of religion are part of his set that he's bringing to the setting of LA, right? They go to the drugstore and then return home. There's a section break, and then Huxley begins to speculate on the ancient origins of, quote, artificial paradises, which of course is a reference to Baudelaire's book on opium and wine. So we know Huxley's been doing his research, right? He then moves to modern usage. He says, we now spend a good deal more on drink and smoke than we spend on education in our culture. This, of course, is not surprising, he says. The urge to escape from selfhood and the environment is in almost everyone all the time. In an interesting twist on Soma from Brave New World, Huxley says, what is needed is a new drug, which will relieve and console our suffering species without doing more harm in the long run than it does good in the short. Such a drug must be potent in minute doses and synthesizable. Mescaline seems a step in this direction, but it's not quite right. Huxley turns then towards religion and drugs, and he's citing this French writer, Philippe de Felice, who wrote extensively on mysticism and drugs, and that might be definitely something for a final research project, especially if those of you who can read French, you might look into some of his work. So Huxley says Christianity distanced itself too much from early origins to provide people with self-transcendence. So Christianity has become sort of diluted or too tame, and it doesn't give us access to this kind of direct mystical experience. At least this is in Huxley's account. And he says Felice's thesis from the book L'Autre Monde, Myths and Legends, Le Purgatoire de Saint Patrice, Saint Patrick's Purgatory, right? Or The Other World, Myths and Legends from St. Patrick's Purgatory, which is a 1906 book. And then Sacred Poisons, Ivresse Divine, an essay on some inferior forms of mysticism from 1936. These are indicative of Felice's long career on mysticism, and also that it really influenced Huxley. And we in our culture today, like especially around psychedelics, we give so much attention and reverence to Huxley, but there hasn't been a lot of research on the people that Huxley was really reading and being influenced by. When we know like William James or something, but I don't think a lot of people in the psychedelic community have gone back and looked at, from a critical eye, looked at people like Philippe de Felice. And this is new. I'm just saying this as a researcher, and this is for those of you who are my students in a class. Like this is paper worthy at conferences to be giving doing that kind of research. Huxley's interest in drugs went well beyond the drug soma, which is the named after the substance, of course, in the Rig Veda in Brave New World. So. This is going to be important because later drug researchers, especially conservatives, will refer to Brave New World sometimes as a reason not to be scared of drugs. And those people have not at all taken Huxley seriously in the breadth of what Huxley was reading. And so again, I'm praising Huxley, and there are ways to be critical of Huxley too. But Huxley was reading massive amounts of material, and he was doing it over several decades of his life, right? So there's a lot more to him than what he says in Brave New World. So going on here, people have incorrectly read Brave New World as an indictment of drugs. For him, drugs offer the ability to transcend selfish solipsism. Written in 1958, an article commissioned by the Saturday Evening Post titled "Drugs That Shape Men's Mind." In that article, Huxley claims that human society is moving closer to the one he described in Brave New World, faster than he ever could have imagined. And Huxley begins in this article lamenting the trap of modern subjectivity. And he goes on to say, quote, correlated with this distaste for the idolatrously worshipped self, there is in all of us a desire, sometimes latent, sometimes conscious and passionately expressed, to escape from the prison of our individuality, an urge to self-transcendence. It is to this urge that we owe mystical theology, spiritual exercise, and yoga. To this, too, that we owe alcoholism and drug addiction. End quote. So again, this passage strongly echoes Philippe de Felice. Huxley also echoes William James's varieties of religious experience here. James, in his famous book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, says, quote, the sway of alcohol over mankind is unquestionably due to its power to stimulate the mystical faculties of human nature. Usually crushed to earth by the cold facts and dry criticisms of the sober hour, sobriety diminishes, discriminates, and says no. Drunkenness expands, unites, and says yes. So again, there's the kind of like distinction, like a parallel kind of between the Apollonian and Dionysian in Nietzsche, and the drunken and the sobriety in James. So later on in this article, Huxley takes his discussion to the level of the state and particularly addresses Cold War issues. He predicts the availability of drugs to help men find happiness and the complex relationship between drugs and personal liberty. He says, quote, it may soon be for us to do something better in the way of chemical self-transcendence than what we have been doing so ineptly for this last 70 or 80 centuries. As his burgeoning theory suggests, Huxley's concerns rest on an evolutionary anthropology in which humans move toward this thing called spirit as the realm into which an individual may situate him or herself to find a balance between subjectivity and objectivity, where objectivity includes both the physical world and the latent unconscious. Huxley was not alone. It's important to situate him in the midst of early 20th century thought on religion. Among the most influential in the United States was Mircea Eliade, who placed a heavy premium on a distinction between the sacred and the profane. And that's one of his most famous books from the end of the 1950s in English, early 50s, I think, in French, called The Sacred and the Profane. In that book, and in his theory in general, drawing on Emile Durkheim's socialist ideas about religion, as well as traditionalist thinkers, Eliade argued that modern man, quote, is out of touch with sacred space, living in the world of the profane and forgetting the centering potential of primitive religious thought. He claimed, quote, so this is Eliade, the sacred reveals absolute reality and at the same time makes orientation possible. Hence, it founds the world in the sense that it fixes the limits and establishes the order of the world. But like many right-wing thinkers, Eliade associated the sacred with an ordering principle for society. Our modern estrangement from that sacred society, from a binding religiosity, was then part of social unrest and despair. And it's important to remember that thinkers like Eliade, and to a certain extent Carl Jung as well, were very, very conservative and in some cases directly influenced or engaging with far-right movements. They were intrigued by fascism. Jung later on kind of denounced that, but Eliade did not. So it's just important to remember that drugs don't, or psychedelic drugs don't automatically make us into kind of left-leaning liberals or hippies and things like that, even though our 21st century culture might have that kind of connotation. And that's the politics of our psychedelics is certainly something that's worth writing and thinking about. So we really need to get a firm grounding in some of this thought on direct experience, whether in mysticism or in writings like Huxley's. We need some firm grounding in the thought on direct experience when approaching mysticism and psychedelics. As historians of religion, such as even Ivan Strensky, note, early 20th century thought on religion emphasized direct experience and methods of phenomenology, and especially the thought of Henry Bergson and Martin Heidegger. Heidegger was another right-wing thinker. For example, Paul Tillich, who had met Heidegger at the University of Marburg in the 1920s, developed his systematic theology by combining existentialism and theology to read revelation and current experience rather than only mediated through Scripture. The impulse was to overcome the confines of the self, while also determining the limits of the self's being. Both Tillich and Eliade sought not only the sacred as something beyond the self, but as something capable of situating. But the self, so the sacred is capable of situating something that creates meaningful, or that is meaningfully in existence. Political liberalism, and so this is not like left liberalism, like liberal Democrats versus right-wing Republicans or something like that, but liberalism, the emphasis on an individual with rights. So political liberalism's emphasis on the self had been expressed during the Romantic era in Europe, when the self-knowledge and reflection arose in proximity to an ineffable or oceanic feeling or experience of otherness and wonder. So there's this big European or Euro-Christian, I will call it, influence that we see showing up in the writings on psychedelics. Max Weber, in his famous book, The Protestant Ethic in the Spirit of Capitalism from 1905, had argued that a Protestant and particularly Puritan mode of being favored the development of a rational bourgeois economic life. It was the most important part and, above all, the only consistent influence in the development of that life. It stood at the cradle of the modern and the economic man. That's a quote from Weber's book. From this, Weber argued that one of the most fundamental aspects of the spirit of modern capitalism and modern culture is, quote, rational conduct on the basis of the idea of a calling, which was born from the spirit of Christian asceticism. This is important. I can't stress enough to think about the ways that Euro-Christian philosophy and Euro-Christian thought has informed the broader production of discourse on psychedelics. Even when it flirts with the Far East or the Middle East, we are getting it filtered through Euro-Christian discourse, and we need to be able to be critical of that and to develop some critical attention. Challenges to this notion of rationality, or instrumental reason is what some philosophers called it, including Max Weber. So there's this kind of desire, right, to break free out of rationality itself, that rationality can't quite give us a complete picture of that missing sacred element that earlier versions of humanity had. This is all, again, in the Euro-Christian kind of linear development way of looking at things. So challenges to the notion of rationality abound throughout the 1950s through the post-war years after World War II. If Christianity had been considered the most rational manifestation of religion developing in European civilization, which had largely imploded during the First and Second World Wars, how could modern people rely on a sense of the rational to orient meaningful life or to act as a kind of secular savior for humanity? The atomic bombs, we could look at that. Like, science was supposed to be this rational, pinnacle of human development, and what does it give us? It gives us the ability to annihilate the entire planet and our own existence as a species, right? So the questioning of the rationality is definitely a mid-20th century discourse that's going on. And of course, this kind of emphasis on what is the madness, what is madness, and what does a what might an insane person have to offer us? And so books like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which doesn't deal directly with psychedelics, you can see why someone like Ken Kesey, who starts creating the electric Kool-Aid acid tests and stuff, he's already being influenced by this psychological literature and this flirtation with madness and insane asylums that's going on throughout the period. So a slow diffusion of thought concerning the exhaustion of rational life made its way across the European continent and eventually the United States during the 1940s and 50s. Max Weber had famously characterized modern life as disenchanted. This early sociological view of religion from Germany echoed French counterparts that were both critiques of English liberalism. And so that's important, that some of the critiques, and especially Emile Durkheim, if you're in religious studies, as Emile Durkheim had written in the Elementary Forms of Religious Life from around 1912, it was published, religion, like language, exists between and among people. It is not about what an individual claims to believe. Quote, the point is to know why experience is not enough but presupposes conditions that are external and prior to it, and how it is that these conditions emerge in proper time and manner, end quote. Durkheim's comment helps us to see the liberal political connection to romantic aesthetics favoring experiential descriptions or the phenomenological view of religion. While Durkheim, like Eliade, saw religious phenomena as a binary between sacred and profane, social rules or rites also occupy a liminality by which we move away from individual experience. Rites are rules of conduct that prescribe how man must conduct himself with sacred things. In the book Purity and Danger from 1966, Mary Douglas follows Talcott Parsons, an earlier sociologist, and his assertion that Durkheim was implicitly arguing in his book against the empiricism that saturated English political philosophy at the time. So these people are writing these books theorizing religion, but they're doing politics at the same time. In thinking about religion, Ivan Strensky notes that the emergence of anthropological and sociological approaches to religion evidenced a cross-pollination among biblical scholars and other scholars. So you have these new sciences like psychology, anthropology, sociology showing up, and cross-pollinating with theology and biblical studies. And particularly biblical historicism in Germany in the late 1800s. So, giving lots of attention to James Frazer, for example, Strensky points out that even though we might later question a thinker's motivation for studying religion, we should separate that from whether or not they studied the way they studied it is valid. So let me just say that again. Giving lots of attention to James Frazer, Strensky points out that even though we might later question a thinker's motivation for studying religion, we should separate that from whether or not the way they studied it is valid. In Strensky's reading, Frazer, so we know that Frazer was wrong about so many things, right? But Strensky's trying to get us to think about something a little bit different and more nuanced. In Strensky's reading, Frazer saw religion as a psychological way to conquer death. Unlike Robertson Smith, another important religious studies thinker of the late 1900s, the late 19th century, unlike Robertson Smith, who saw the ritual instinct as primary, James Frazer saw myths as a vital and primitive aspect in human civilization's formation. Moreover, the myths that mattered were those that related to cults and religions working to enhance life by means of the performance of the sacrifice of the god. So we get from James Frazer this intense look on what the meaning of sacrifice is. That's going to be really important for us in later for thinkers about psychedelics. During the period, Freud and Eliade later extended this view by relegating religious affection to the unconscious. But as Strensky emphasizes in his book, Thinking About Religion, Strensky emphasizes that both phenomenologists and psychoanalysts found it quite difficult to let go of these evolutionary ideas about religion, especially the idea that Christianity represented the highest or most evolved religion. So we see that throughout. I will call it the European fantasy structure in my own book. And a lot of us, because we're influenced by that, because it saturates our own culture, a lot of people, when they first start thinking about psychedelics and about religion, haven't really sort of unpacked that European fantasy or Euro-Christian fantasy structure. And we need to do that. We sort of need to decolonize the ways that we've been discursively informed to think about what religion is. So Huxley, whose grandfather had coined the term agnostic and championed the Charles Darwin, he was known as Darwin's bulldog, had no love for Christianity. Yet even Huxley remained fascinated with trends towards mysticism and theosophy especially. So moreover, we see in his speculations on the possibility for psychologists to employ drug chemistry to better treat human society, a more evolved push away from religion, which had only been able to crudely deal with human needs, the human need to become inebriated or temporarily experience ecstatic states. So even in Huxley, and this is what I mean about being a little bit critical of Huxley, we see that he's got this evolutionary, developmental type of view that he's imposing onto what he thinks psychedelics might be able to do. And you will see that kind of thinking all the way into 2022. And that's something I think that we really need to be critical of when we see it in researchers. He sees this more evolved way of pushing away from religion. Again, remember he said like 70 or 80 centuries, right? So 700 to 800 years that Huxley sees all of this, the problems of religion, and he thinks that drugs might be a way out of that. In this, we see a lot of influence in Huxley of Sigmund Freud, who Freud himself was also no lover of religion. And Huxley totally takes Freud to task in some ways in Brave New World. So Huxley has a love-hate relationship with Freud. But Freud says, importantly in Civilization and Its Discontents, that like somebody had written to him about the oceanic feeling of religion, and Freud says he doesn't really have this oceanic feeling. And I think it's important to attach that to Freud's Jewishness, although that might be something to talk about with me in office hours or something. That Freud's Jewishness maybe gives him a little bit of an outsider perspective on this European fantasy structure or Euro-Christian fantasy structure. But both Sigmund Freud and Aldous Huxley were very critical of religion. And they saw in their various ways, not so much Freud in terms of drugs, because early on he had flirted with cocaine and then he kind of gets disaffected with cocaine. And Freud dies before the LSD is really, widely known. I can't remember. It's synthesized first in 1938, but nobody really knows about it till the 1940s. And Freud was dead by then. So the psychologizing of religion that shows up in phenomenological accounts, in thinkers like James Frazer, for example, the psychologizing of religion combined with an interest in the sacred would later emerge in developments in transpersonal psychology. In such a view, religion served as a social function to expand one's sense of individuality and merge with a larger social body. A more essential and spiritual notion of the self persists beneath the layers of identity. The layers of identity accumulated within the individuated experience of a single person's life. Historically, mysticism had explored these outer boundaries of the self and what moderns would call ego dissolution through merging with the sacred or a mystical body. So this is why mysticism and this new discourse on religion and drugs is going to become really important. And so Rudolf Otto again had identified this in his 1923 book through his phenomenological examination of the idea of the holy, and again his term the mysterium tremendum. And again that book is called The Idea of the Holy. Prefiguring Huxley then, Otto had noted that interest in miracles was far from evidencing an anti-rationalistic attitude. Rather, concern for the miraculous is made meaningful only by one who wants to view the limits of rationality. So we get this kind of language of like, what is a miracle? What constitutes a miracle? And there are lots of graduate study courses in the past 10 years that have been looking at the critical theory around miracles, for example. But we might look at that and look at that as a phenomenon of discourse going on from the 1920s to the 1960s, right? Why did these modern people become so fascinated with the idea of what a miracle is? Orthodox religion, according to Otto, had lost its power. Sound like someone? Sound like Huxley, maybe? Orthodox religion had lost its power by becoming too rational. So far from keeping the non-rational element in religion alive in the heart of religious experience, Orthodox Christianity manifestly failed to recognize its value, and by this failure gave to the idea of God a one-sided intellectualistic and rationalistic interpretation. Because the concept of the holy has for Otto come to be moralized as inherently invoking the good, he substitutes the notion of noumen, or the idea of the numinous, to designate the ineffable excess that seems to exist outside of rationality. This was the original and ancient sense of the holy, according to Otto, which included a sense of awe before the divine, which was not necessarily viewed as benevolent towards humans. The numinous, for Otto, is the source for what he calls, quote, creature consciousness, the feeling that one's existence depends on something larger. It is the emotion of a creature abased and overwhelmed by its own nothingness, in contrast to that which is supreme above all creatures. From the numinous comes the feeling of the mysterium tremendum, which can either gently sweep over someone or arrive at an instant. Otto then buys into a Euro-Christian historicizing of this feeling, associating it with primitive aspects of human development. Therefore, there is something about the mysterium tremendum that also transports one back in time on a linear scale of the development of human consciousness. I want to reemphasize that. It transports someone back in time. So there's this linear development, Euro-Christian consciousness thing, evolution, and this ability of the sacred, which we've kind of forgotten in our modern disenchanted life, that allows us to return back. This is part of the Euro-Christian fantasy structure. In my book, I call this tendency among Euro-Christians a European fantasy structure, but I've changed my language to Euro-Christian these days. It's important for studying psychedelics because it shows up over and over again in the idea that by taking psychedelics, we can somehow tap into something archaically and fundamentally human. It is the source of much white supremacy and racism, especially when it gets superimposed onto indigenous peoples. I will be highly critical of this throughout my course, to the point where sometimes people who have not thought much about psychedelics will read me as being anti-psychedelics altogether. I'm not anti-psychedelics. I'm anti the Euro-Christian fantasy structure that tends to situate politics around drugs and drug discourse in a certain Euro-Christian and white supremacist way. Such is how deeply rooted Euro-Christian supremacy is in our culture today. That's like my task in this course. That's a big task, and we'll get there, by the end lectures. And it might seem really heavy or heady right now, or hard to get there, and I might seem overly critical, so I just ask you to bear with me from the outset here. As an example of the fantasy structure, we can look at other psychedelic classics such as Antonin Artaud's Peyote Dance, or Henri Michaud's Miserable Miracle, which is a beautiful book. I didn't assign it in this class, but if you're interested in this stuff, Miserable Miracle is a great book about psychedelic experience. Michaud writes of his mescaline experience, quote, "To the eye and the mind of someone who is or has been in another state, everything moves, everything is vibrant and teeming with reality. On mescaline," he says, quote, "the forms almost always innumerable, incredibly elongated, exaggeratedly frail and slender, hollowed out in the middle, disclosing hairline minarets, columns like little pinnacles that are altogether too dainty, lozenges, and all the things that are thinnest and most elongated and frail. Often, instead of being hollowed out, they are broken in the middle or in several places. For anyone who has taken mescaline, even one once, the arts of Mexico, the Zapotec and Toltec statues, Aztec temples, with their multiple broken lines, become eloquent, taking on new significance. End quote. That's all in Michaud. While this specific passage does not rise to the level of racism apparent among many Euro-Christian writers, we are very close to the kind of fetishizing of primitive man, in quotes, right, primitive man, present in Artaud and in later films such as Altered States, because hovering right around these connections Michaud makes to indigenous Mexican life is the Eliade-inspired notion of the archaic revival. We must note that enthusiasts for the archaic revival, from Terence McKenna to those who regularly attend Burning Man, see their behavior as a corrective critique to modern alienation. Whatever critiques they make, however, implicitly employ the Euro-Christian fantasy structure, often universalizing notions of experience and superimposing them onto other cultures. This is the source of a great deal of expropriation and appropriation of indigenous practices. As we will see in coming weeks, a critical approach to psychedelics and mysticism must ask some difficult questions about whether or not our very conceptions of mysticism are vehicles for the transmission of white or Euro-Christian supremacy. We will want to consider the ongoing problems of such imbricated thought as we examine the rhetorical positions people take to advocate for psychedelic use and drug research in the 21st century. In Richard Doyle's book, Darwin's Pharmacy, he, for example, argues that, quote, in responding to global climatic change, we must less adapt than evolve. Again, that evolutionary language showing up. And this evolution, he says, begins with the recognition of plants and the earth itself as a power, perhaps as a superpower worthy of time. So we see this kind of language a lot, like that it is part of our next stage of evolution to recognize plants. But indigenous people have always recognized plants. So who are these people that need to evolve, really? Doyle says, quote, in order to alter what we do, we must re-engineer and reimagine what we are. Across the life of climate sciences, the news is this. You are deeply implicated in the global ecosystem in the ways scientific and technical practices are only beginning to comprehend and model. If the breakthroughs in medical and global imaging systems have provided us with revelations, they reveal that our separateness from ecosystems is itself an illusion, and that we are membranes inseparable from a global ecology. Now, I might agree with a lot of what Doyle says there, but who is he talking about, right? Because indigenous people and indigenous worldviews have always had this, right? And the Euro-Christian worldview is going to be to situate those indigenous people as part of the past, or as having this direct connection to this archaic past. And they're going to bring all of their romanticized notions of the noble savage that are completely racist to that as well. So it becomes really problematic. So, but to come back to Doyle here, such rhetoric is really powerful right now in the age of climate change, right? And once we can see, one can see how on one level it is a critique of Euro-Christian culture's projection of, quote, man, since the Renaissance as separated and alienated from nature. Yeah. The rhetoric implies not only that we are becoming more immanent, as in Charles Taylor's idea of the immanent frame, but that our very evolution and survival as a species requires in some way returning to a state of nature. But that notion of state of nature that occupies so many well-intentioned attempts to embrace indigenous life has yet to reflect seriously on the inherently genocidal tendencies Euro-Christian culture, in both its religious and secularized forms, have brought to indigenous peoples. How easily Euro-Christians feel they can tap into what all humanity needs at the species level, including the ability that psychedelics may have for accessing such universalizing sensibility. Lots to be critical of, lots to think about. I'll stop there for the day. Thank you for listening.